thank you for having me to do this talk today. I'm excited about this talk, and it was originally scheduled for back when COVID hit. So here we are 5 months later and back on track. So I just wanted to give everyone a bit of background. So my background is not in accounting or finance. It's actually in health sci. And then I went back and did my master's in research management. So this talk really comes from that lens. So I think most of the folks on this call will probably be in that same boat, where we come from health science backgrounds, and then we try to do some budgets, and we don't always know where to start. And so, yeah, so my talk is going to go through some challenges, and we'll talk about some of the resources that CTO has to offer for budgeting. So I wanted to have a conflict of interest slide. I don't personally have any conflicts of interest. Our research group has many. So we are funded by lots of different granting agencies and pharma companies. So they're all listed here. And so I do have lots of experience with budgeting with some of those trials, though. So hopefully we can talk about some of those things today. So I have put together some learning objectives. I want to go through what a study budget is, challenges of budgeting for clinical trials, the importance of doing feasibility, reviewing the tools on the CTO website, looking at some mistakes I've made personally, and maybe you folks can learn from those, and financial management after budgeting and budgeting during COVID is what we're going to do. So my slides have changed here to a different view. Oh, there we go. Okay. Okay, so what is a study budget? So I think the overall goal when we start a new project is to develop a fair and accurate and a justifiable budget. I think those are really important. And the different components include startup costs, closeout costs, the per patient cost, invoiceable items, and overhead. And we'll talk about each of these items throughout this presentation. I did want to give you a bit of a background about budgeting in kind of my field of expertise, which is cognitive impairment. So we're lucky enough in our field to have a consortium that actually budgets on sites' behalf. And it was established back in 1991 when investigator staff were going to different realized that the budgets weren't always the same. Some sites in Toronto had different budgets than sites in London or Ottawa. And so as a group, we really kind of came together to kind of cost out the different activities that we do for this type of research, and to make it transparent and fair actually across the entire country. So most of our sites are academic, and I did have a quick peek at some folks who registered, and it does look like most of the people registered are from academic sites, so in the same boat as us here at Parkwood Institute. And so when this consortium was established, it was really to create a fair budget across sites for the same trial. And it was to complete negotiations on the site's behalf to really cover costs and coming up with a balanced budget. So currently I do negotiate budgets for that consortium still. And every time there's a new project, we kind of develop a little budget team, and we hash out the budget together. So that's kind of where my background comes from, and where we're at within our own field for cognitive impairment. So I wanted to go through some of the challenges, start off going through some challenges that we see when we start thinking about study budgets. And the first is that in the number of years that at least I've worked in clinical research, the complexity of study protocols has increased, and it's increased a lot. And this has big impacts on our study budgets. So we have increase in total number of endpoints, increased in step procedures, increases in inclusion and exclusion criteria, and if I think about my own area of research, you started off 10 years ago, a physician would make a clinical diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease and the participant would be enrolled in a trial. Now we have neuroimaging and genetics involved. And so our screen failure rates have gone up, as well as the length of visits, the length of the screening period. And I think that all of these things have really do impact our study budget, and we have to think about those things when we're trying to come up with a budget. And in addition, there are more countries and investigator sites involved in trials, so things are really growing in the field of clinical research. The second challenge is associated with the complexity of the study protocol. And again, to talk to that screen fail rate, we used to see participants and we'd have a 10% screen fail rate, and now it's gone up to as high as 80% for some trials. So that has a big impact when you're talking about getting funding on a per patient budget, per patient enrolled. With increased complexity, it often takes longer to get studies approved, which can then delay your startup time. And it often involves more amendments. So we've even had projects that have started up and we think we're ready to go, and then an amendment comes and we actually have to put screening on hold until we get that amendment approved. And so it can really impact your budget, impact your timelines. And so I think these are things we need to be aware of. Often Canada can be at a disadvantage due to competitive enrollment. If we're selected as a secondary site, other sites might be selected before us, and that'll impact your budget. And all of these things together really do impact your target enrollment. And we'll tie that into how that impacts the budget and how to kind of deal with that and set goals within your group to avoid these types of things. So I think the challenge that we're all on this call to kind of talk about today is to actually build a fair and transparent per patient budget. Almost all clinical trial budgets that I see are based on a per participant enrolled. We do have some experience in the past dealing with budgets that did try to compensate coordinator salary, and they didn't work out very well. Not always on the site's end, but from the sponsor's end. If you're paying someone to do work, they don't always recruit as many participants. If there's staff turnover, it has a negative impact with retraining and then keeping participants coming in to the different sites. So they generally haven't worked in the past, and I think that's why we do see per patient budgeting. And then I think the biggest challenge, though, when you talk about a per patient budget is that you have staff costs, which are fixed, and then you have payments that are variable. So you're paid for the work done and the payments aren't done in real time. So if you're a new site, how do you float staff costs to get all the startup procedures done? And if you have a high screen fail rate and you have someone working full time, what does that mean for your site? So I think this is one of the biggest challenges with per patient budgets, and we can talk about that as the presentation goes on. And then the delays in project timelines, as we've talked about in the last couple of slides, also have big impact on these budgets. So I think every site, as we're talking about budgets, really needs to think of their costs and understanding the cost at the site level. So the first cost might be to think about as overhead, and this does vary across the province. So we do work with other sites, and you'll see some overhead at 25%, other overhead as high as 40%. This is institutional overhead. If you're with a private site, you're usually setting that overhead yourself, and they usually run around 5 to 40%. So you just have to know what your overhead is when you're developing these budgets. I think staff salaries and benefits are another cost that you have to understand at your site, as well as your individual startup and closeout fees. You need to start thinking about your renewal fees, and this can change depending on what type of research you do. So at my own site, when I think about what are our renewal fees, everyone probably has ethics renewal fees that you have to make sure that you have tied into your budget. You might have pharmacy renewal fees every year. They might charge you a renewal fee to, go through any changes and just to start a new fiscal year. Imaging sites might have the same type of fees, as well as if you have any lab costs. So you just have to know what these fees are and then make sure that you incorporate them into your budgets. Another site cost that I wanted to add in here is archiving. So I've always kind of set a flat fee for archiving at our site. We are very fortunate to have on-site archiving. So when a study ends, I like to keep it on site for, 3 to 5 years in case queries come back, and then we can pull the data really easily to answer any queries that come after closeout. So recently we sent 36 boxes off site, and it cost us almost $21,000, and it was just way more than I had expected. The cost had gone up quite a bit since the last time we had sent boxes off site. And so I think staying up to date on what your local fees are for different services that you rely on is important. And that's something that we learned last year. And then understanding equipment costs and supply costs. So a lot of protocols will have different procedures in it. Some you might be familiar with, others might be new. And just knowing what equipment you need for those procedures and what supplies you need on hand and how much those do cost. So is really important, as well as not forgetting about calibration. So every year we calibrate our different equipment, and we're calibrating different equipment, and it costs about $100 per piece of equipment. So we're very fortunate that we can, there we go, sorry about that. We're very fortunate that we have in-service staff in the hospital that can actually do calibration. And then they charge us internally, but it is a significant cost. So if you have a thermometer, for example, and you're looking to calibrate it, it's going to cost you $100 at our site to do so. And so sometimes it's just cheaper to actually throw out equipment and buy new equipment. And so those are kinds of things you need to think about when you're understanding your different site costs. And the last challenge I wanted to bring up, which people don't always talk about when we're discussing budgets, but I really want folks to start thinking about the kind of relationship that you build with CROs and sponsors as you negotiate budgets, and start a relationship with folks, especially different companies that have a lot of products or new medications in your field that you might be working with over a long-term basis. So you want to have good communication with these different sponsors or CROs. You need to understand who's approving a budget. So a budget comes into your site, and maybe the CRO is presenting the budget, but the sponsor has final sign-off. So sometimes it's good to get on a call with everyone. You get everyone in on a call, understand expectations, timelines, and any kind of really strict budgetary items up front, and it saves a lot of back and forth. And when you're working with these folks external to your site, sponsors or CROs, you need to consider your site's reputation. So when you're, a lot of sites often will request higher budgets, which is fine. Sometimes budgets come in low and we do have to request higher budgets, but that when you request higher budgets, it often comes with an expectation for your site that you'll have higher quality data and maybe greater output. And this is going to be really important for future projects that you're going to work with the same CRO and sponsor. So at our site, for example, we're working in cognitive impairment, and some of our trials are quite lengthy. We might have a 3-year double-blind phase followed by a 2-year open-label extension, and then that might be a phase 2, and then we might end up rolling into a phase 3 trial. So we could be working with the same sponsor on the same project for a decade. So we want to make sure that we're coming up with a fair and transparent budget that we're all happy with at the end, and that these relationships are important as you continue to work with these folks for quite some time, and that we have the same end goal. And the end goal is that we're conducting a safe and ethical trial that will advance research within our field. So I think that is the important end goal, and we need to keep that in mind when we're building budgets. And it's not always about getting the highest budget possible, but getting a fair budget that everyone can agree on and is happy with. So I want to now sorry, I skipped a couple slides. Okay, so I wanted to talk about feasibility really quickly before we kind of got into the CTO tools that are available for everyone to use, and why going through feasibility before finalizing your budget is really, really important. And this is a step that a lot of sites actually don't do. It's something that they skip, and I suggest that you don't skip it. I think you need to focus on feasibility before you finalize your budget. You need to objectively review the protocol, You need to know that you have the right study population, the timelines of the project, resources at site, equipment available, staff availability, staff qualifications also to make sure you have the qualified staff to run the trial, and space. And it's okay to say no to trials. I think at sites, every time we're offered a trial, we want to say yes. We're excited about doing research, and we all have this idea that anytime someone approaches us about a trial, we say yes to it. But I think you need to do the right trial for your research group, and it's okay to say no. I think finding out as much as possible about the protocol and really diving into the protocol and going through the nitty-gritty is important. If you have the opportunity to go to an investigator meeting, which aren't happening right now, but potentially substituted for a webinar before finalizing your budget, you'll get some really neat information there before you have a chance to finalize your budget. You might learn about different assessments that are kind of vague in the protocol that really have massive impacts on your budget overall. And so, oh shoot, sorry, I keep skipping slides. So my suggestion would be to develop a tool or some kind of decision tree to complete feasibility. I've given an example of some questions that you might have a group meeting about, that you might want to talk about when looking at different protocols. And I want to highlight a couple. And one of them is how long you think it's going to take to get the study approved. This is really important when thinking about timelines. And how long you will to, and it ties into how long you'll have to enroll participants. So if you're offered a trial and, you know, potentially it's competing with another trial right away, and so you might have, and you've got to do ethics and you've got to do all your startup, and let's say it's going to start in 4 months. And then from that 4-month time mark, you have 2 months to recruit participants, and you've agreed to enroll 10, and, you know, that falls over December, and patients don't want to come in over the holidays and staff are on vacation. I think all these things are really important for you when you're thinking about starting a new trial, because if you recruit one participant, it's not always worth it financially. It takes a long time to start up a trial, and you put a lot of effort into it, and then recruitment ends and you have one participant, and then you have to do all the amendments and everything like that. So I think starting to ask these questions and knowing whether it's feasible to even meet your deadlines and your all the different things the study sponsor wants you to do. I think you really need to think about these questions, and you might add some, you might take some away, but just to start thinking about this process before finalizing a budget to make sure it's worth it for your site. So now we're going to switch and actually start talking about budgeting and looking at some of the tools available. I do have to say that I really wish that when I started budgeting that we had tools like this on a website that we could use to get started. I think these are excellent tools. I think you will, at individual sites, have to put time in and start really starting from scratch for your particular site potentially, but I think it'll be worth it. So I think these tools are great, and if you have an opportunity to use them, you should. So when you log into CTO, that link that was on the previous slide, it'll bring you to this tool, which is building a budget, and you'll start with, you'll open this Excel spreadsheet, which you can save and customize for yourself, which is awesome. And there you'll start with this instruction slide, and then you're gonna move in to this research procedure cost worksheet. So this is where you can start to really cost out what the different procedures within your research protocols are going to cost. So you can start at the top and you can plug in all your different staff members and what their salary is and what their benefits are. Understanding benefits, and if you have to talk to someone in HR or finance to understand what the benefits are at your site, that's important. Don't underestimate how much benefits cost and how much employer costs are. Even if people aren't taking home in lieu of benefits, there are fringe benefits that everyone has to pay. And then starting to go through the different research activities and costing out the different things that you'll do at your site. So I just wanted to make a couple points from that slide. And I think the biggest mistake that I sometimes find people make is they don't factor in different staff salaries. So on that previous slide, you'd see you might have a research nurse and a research coordinator, maybe a research associate, and they all have different salaries. And if you're, for example, costing out vitals, you might use your research associate at a lower salary to do that task. And then halfway through the trial, if that person were to leave and you don't fill that spot, and then you have, for example, your research nurse doing that assessment at a higher cost, do you have wiggle room for that? So I just want to make sure that when you're developing these budgets, you really think about staff turnover and who is actually long-term going to be doing some of these assessments. And I'll sometimes even average out salaries. So I might take my research nurse and my associate and find a salary in the middle, and then use that for some of my costing. And then that way, if depending on who does it, I might be able to bank a little bit of funds, or I might have to pay a little bit more, but it'll all work out in the long run. And so I think those are the kinds of things to think about. And then I think it's really important on a regular basis to communicate with staff on how long it actually takes them to do different items. So I feel like we sometimes underestimate the time that it takes to actually do some of the procedures within the protocol, and just making sure that is an ongoing conversation is important for future budgeting. Mm-hmm. So as you go through the different tabs along the bottom of this workbook that is on the CTO website, the next one will be protocol costing. So this is where you take the different costs that you've developed in the previous worksheet, and now you're actually plugging them in to your protocol timetable, and you can actually start to get a per visit cost and a per patient cost. So you can start to see that it all starts to come together here with all the different assessments. I did want to add that for a lot of the studies that we do, I like to add indirect costs. So far we've kind of talked about direct costs that happen during the visits. And I do usually have a second, or I guess a third subsection at the bottom of that previous spreadsheet, where I have like a little indirect per patient fee cost. And I add things like an investigator fee, a study coordinator fee, nurse fee, data management fee, etc. And this just really accounts for some of the behind the scenes costs that don't happen maybe when the participant is right in front of you at the visit, but maybe it's the scheduling or the AEs, or reviewing different procedures or setting up procedures before the participant comes. So I do think, even though you're costing out the procedures appropriately, I do think you need a section where you account for some of the additional fees that are related but to the actual visit, but aren't actually budgeted for. And you'll kind of learn, and this is again, like, so a visit that takes a really long time, you might have an additional study coordinator fee to account for, the in-between time that the coordinators are not actually being paid for any assessment. So again, this will be something that you can kind of track to see how long study visits take, and then different visits, you might even assign different study coordinator fees or a different investigator fee. I've even done like a light investigator fee and a light coordinator fee versus like for visits that are a little bit longer, I'll just have a regular fee for those visits. So it's just something to think about in that spreadsheet that you can add to cover some additional costs. Okay, so now we're moving along the bottom of this workbook in the budgeting tool here, and we're at the research cost worksheet. So this is, again, looking at different assessments that happen throughout your project that really you can cost out, looking at time and hourly rate for different staff members. You can see it's really great. You can assign some of these things to your startup fees or your closeout fees. So this is great justification for those fees once you start looking at those different items. Different things in here for training and for monitoring visits, audits, etc. And then you can really start costing these out. And there are some of these costs, like when I look back at that spreadsheet, you might want to try to include in your per patient budget. Like if you're doing drug accountability at each visit, that might be something that you add to your per patient spreadsheet. But maybe you're doing drug accountability once at the end of the trial, and then it would be appropriate to have it in an invoiceable cost. So just go through some of these items and kind of plug them into your your workbook as appropriate, where you need them for your specific area of research. For us, for example, like the contract negotiation, that's part of our overhead at our institution. So that would be covered that way. But at other sites, it most certainly is not. So you definitely want to have that as a line item. So these are just different examples. You can definitely add to these, but just to get you to start thinking about what are the different items that you need to include in budgets and where to include them. And then as I move on to the invoiceable items, actually the bottom of the slide got cut off, but it's actually the last tab in that workbook. Some of the costs from the research cost workbook I would include in my invoiceable items, but that previous worksheet just kind of showed you how to actually cost them out. These fees here are usually very set fees. So your archiving fee, right here, we've got maybe $100 a box. I would say that that's a little bit of a low estimate based on my recent experience with archiving boxes, but you get the idea. You need to reach out to different vendors and to different departments and figure out what these costs are going to be. And these are your fixed costs, and you can add them with the other costs for your invoiceable items. So these are the different invoiceable items that we have at our site. Some, again, are participant related, some are study related. Some things that I want to highlight that are a little bit different. You might need translation. I'm not sure if I saw anyone on the call that was from an institution that might need translation, but there are fees for that, and they vary across the country, again, having to translate materials for some of our own studies. So that's something to always keep in mind. And then for study related, I always say, if you have an item that you think that you can get, that you can invoice for, then you should try to include it in your budget, knowing that the sponsor isn't going to actually agree to all of these. So you're going to have some negotiation back and forth, and the sponsor is going to say, hey, there's no way I'm going to pay for that. And that might be okay. Maybe you're getting compensated for something else and you're willing to forgo one of these invoiceable items. A good one on this list is audits. I know sometimes sponsors will pay for audits. Other times they'll say it has nothing to do with us. That's the site's responsibility. And there's trade-offs within budget negotiations, and that's okay. But if you don't ask for it, you won't get it, right? So if you ask for it, at least you can have that conversation and kind of say why you think it's important, and you can go from there. But if you don't ask for it, you will not get it. So I wanted to switch gears just a tiny little bit and talk about some grant funded clinical trials, because I know, looking at some of the folks who are registered, a lot of people are working at academic institutions across the country. So at some point or another, you might have to put together a budget for a specific grant, which are very different than putting together a budget for a clinical trial with a sponsor. I've had some experience doing this over COVID, my first very big grant to CRHR. And so I wanted to talk about that a little bit. And then if you have access to these slides and you ever need to do this, you can refer to them. I think it would have been helpful for me doing my first grant. So first of all, each grant has very specific budget outlines, and you're going to have to read this very carefully and know what you're allowed to actually put into your budget and what you're not allowed to put into the budget. And each grant is going to be very specific. And then also within the grant, know that there's some things that you might not actually invoice for other trials. Like, for example, CHR allows for compensation for travel to present your results at conferences, which is great. So make sure you include that. If they're going to allow you to do that, then make sure that that's something that you budget for. So I'm going to give the example of CHR because this is a budget that I've done recently, but this was for a COVID-related trial, a clinical trial across several sites. And so when you look at their website before you submit it, this is what you see. So it's a bare bones budget. You have research staff, you have research trainees, materials, supplies, and services, travel, equipment, and then that's it. And the equipment actually is the guidelines and the regulations for equipment within that section is actually fairly strict. So you may or may not actually be able to include equipment into your budget. So you have to be careful with that too. And so if you look at this budget and you go down to the third section, you'll see materials, supplies, and services, and other is the majority of my budget. And so you think to yourself, well, that's not super transparent. So then as an attachment for this, this is what the budget looked like. And this is a very busy slide, and I don't expect you to review all of this, but this is the kind of detail that they're actually looking for. So when we got our feedback from the reviewers back, the budget was highlighted to be very well done. And so that's why I'm sharing it, and hopefully you can use this for future projects. But you literally need, and again, if you look on the first column, I did break it down as a cost per patient enrolled based on the number of hours that I thought each visit would take. So I kept with my per patient enrollment budget, and then I just added everything else that we need. So I just want people to start thinking about if you're used to doing clinical trial budgets or you're new to budgeting altogether, the kind of detail you need to fund a clinical trial yourself. So you need to think of things like how much it's going to cost to send shipments, how much it's going to cost to have blood tubes sent to your site, and things that you just normally take for granted for clinical trials when those things are actually supplied for you. And so I know these slides are going to be up for people to look at. So I think this is a really good template you can use that if you have to put together that type of budget. But again, because I do like the per patient budgets, and I don't always think that, I haven't seen a project that has worked really well based on coordinator time. I did stick with that. So anyway, this is for your reference, and if you use it, great. If not, that's okay too. So we're going to talk about budget negotiations, which we've talked about a little bit throughout these slides. And my biggest point is just to stay organized. You need to stay organized because there's a lot of back and forth that goes with these negotiations, and it can be really easy to miss an item and then you're going to regret it later. So, and these are lessons I have learned the hard way. So these are things that I've done wrong. And now I've learned to stay a little bit more organized. So it can take several versions back and forth to get a budget approved. And I know I hear a lot that some sponsors won't negotiate a line item budget. And so, we have these beautiful line item budgets. The sponsor's not going to approve them or negotiate with those. And that's okay. It's okay to do that, but I think you still need to make them, and you still need to have them for your own reference. So you make your budget, and then at the end of the day, maybe the sponsor's just looking at the per visit cost, and then the total cost for a participant, and that's okay. Because then if you work with that sponsor in the future and there's twice as much work for a new project, you can say, okay, well, you've got some justification to increase budgets and say, well, this other, project, you only had these visits, and the cost per visit or the cost per participant were this, and now you have additional procedures, and so the budget should go up. So it will come in handy later on, and I think you won't, and it'll help keep you organized also. Some sponsors will come back and forth with track changes, or they use the comments function, which seems fine if you have like one negotiation process, but after version 3, 4, maybe even 5, all of a sudden those comments and those track changes get really messy. So my advice is to just save separate versions with the dates. I actually keep a negotiation tab, so I'll add an additional tab with negotiations, and I'll talk about, on this date I sent version 1 and we negotiated on these things, and then in the future I can use that for my future reference about why, oh my goodness, I only charge this much for this assessment when normally I'd charge more. And then I can go back through my negotiation tab and be like, oh, we didn't get as much for that item, but maybe we got a little bit more on a different item. So it kind of worked out, but it's good for your own future reference. It's good to keep you organized. And I think the sponsors really like that too, because then they can kind of see what's happening as you progress with your negotiations. So here are some common mistakes, which I always like talking about. So I've gone through a few. I'm sure others on the call might have different mistakes that they can share. But I think one of the biggest things that I still see is standard of care versus study-related assessments. So I don't think this is purposeful. I think that this is just something that sponsors assume they won't have to pay for. And a good example is lab work. So people come into our geriatric clinics and they might say, well, just pull that lab work, and can you do some additional lab work before you screen the subject? Well, no, we can't do that. It's not part of standard of care. So if you want that, you have to pay for that. Another one is MRI scans. There are certain criteria for folks that come through the clinic. Some will get MRI scans and some won't. It's not always in a timely fashion either. So if you want to wait for an MRI scan result, then that might be okay, but then study recruitment might be done at that point. So just talking with sponsors and letting them know that if they want certain assessments done, they have to be part of the protocol. And they're usually actually really good about that, but you will still see that. And then another item is overlooking hidden assessments in the fine print. So when you're looking at your table of assessments and, you're going through and everything, might seem fairly straightforward for your area of expertise, and you just kind of move forward. And a good example I have is, we do cognitive assessments, and I know how to cost cognitive assessments, but, for one of our clinical trials, there was an eye exam related to a possible adverse event. And so an eye exam, well, the geriatricians, they can do that in clinic. That sounds great. And I ticked the box, and it was costed out, and we went on our way. And then in amendments, it actually turned out that it had to be an ophthalmologist. They had to be seen off site. They had to have specialized equipment. The assessments took about 2 hours to be completed by another trained healthcare professional. So this was just something I didn't think of. I should have stopped. I should have asked more questions, but I didn't. And then it was a bit of a headache for us once the trial got up and going. Another common mistake, which and not to say that everyone on this call, everyone aren't superstars, but I think sometimes we overestimate staff efficiencies. So we think to ourselves, oh yeah, data entry, that takes 30 minutes, done. Well, maybe not. Maybe data entry takes a couple of hours. We're doing a trial right now, which is an investigator-initiated trial, and the data entry can take up to 4 hours. These are trained research staff with lots of experience. It's just more challenging. So I think, I know we always ask for ECRFs from the sponsor before we get a trial up and running. It helps us build our source documents, and then you can kind of start to see what the data entry looks like before you finalize your budget. So these are things that sometimes we don't think of, but if it takes you twice as long to do your data entry, that's not, that it's not free, right? Your staff have to do that. So something to think about. And then again, we talked about in the invoiceable item, not including possible invoiceable items in the initial budget. So you should ask for everything. We work with a site that when we do cognitive clinical trials, they have to have sophisticated neuroimaging, and the neuroimaging site is actually 2.5 hours away. And so in the initial budget review for that site, they're going to want to get some travel reimbursement for participants who have to travel back and forth to that imaging site often. And you want to make sure that's in your budget. It also, once you get good reimbursement for participants, or potentially even a hotel for bad weather, it really does help with recruitment and retention. So, you say to your participants, you've got to travel out of town to this neuroimaging site, but, we'll put you up in a hotel, we'll get you something to eat. So they just don't have to stress about rushing, or about weather, or about nighttime driving, or different things that happen within our patient population. And so it all kind of ties together. So that's something to think about when you're looking at budgets. Are all the assessments done in your hospital? Or are you sending folks off-site? How far away are those assessments going to be done? And do I need to get additional patient travel or different things set up for those kinds of things? And then I always try to consider a contingency fund. Some sponsors will look at this and they'll say, no, thank you. There's absolutely no way I'm putting a contingency fund in here. But other sponsors kind of like it. They say they put some rules around it and some very specific wording around the contingency fund at the beginning. And then it does allow for things to be paid for without a budget renegotiation. So sometimes sponsors will like it, sometimes not. But if you can get it in there, sometimes we'll put it in for $20,000 or $25,000. That'll cover some equipment or something that we might have missed in the budget. And then again, you don't have to renegotiate. So it kind of works out well. So here's my eye exam example. in the amendment, they actually did change it to ophthalmology exam, but originally in the footnotes, it basically just said complete prior to dosing. So we didn't really have any idea. And then we found out that, you know, we needed all these different things and it had to be done offsite. So something to think about. So I'm going to switch gears really quickly to financial management. I know that I'm checking my time here, and so I've still got a few slides to go. But it does look like most sites, most folks on this call are from academic sites. I am from an academic site. So if you're from a private site and you have some software that does financial management for you, then that is just awesome, and I am very jealous, and you keep using that. But that is not the case at our site. It's not a case in a lot of sites across the province or across the country. And so whenever we get a new study, I add it to a little finance tracker that I've developed, and anyone can develop their own tracker, but I do think it's really important for a lot of reasons to keep track, very detailed track of your finances. So I have a summary sheet with study 1 through 9. Our fiscal year, the majority of our projects are April to March, and so that's my fiscal year up there. And I just keep track of each study individually, and then along the bottom of my tracker, I have each study where I can open up an individual Excel spreadsheet where I keep track of the finances. And then at any given time, I have totals. And so it's really good for staffing to know how much money you have in a bank account so that you can hire new staff or not. And so I do recommend keeping track of your finances in a method like this if you don't have software to do it for you. When you open up each of the individual tabs along the bottom of your workbook, this is just, you know, I've made this up, a study. Lucky me, I have $500,000 in it. Wouldn't it be great if all of our accounts had that? And so I can look at my revenue. I can look at all the different payables that I have for that account, my ethics, salaries. We buy cafeteria vouchers, and we give parking, imaging, and then HMMS for us is study supplies, so all the study supplies I buy. So I can keep track of everything that comes in and out of these accounts. And then I also, at the top under revenue, I know when all my checks are coming in or my EFTs are coming in. And so I can really honestly keep track of every penny coming in and out of each of my accounts, which is important because within our institution, we just don't have a way to do this. I think our finance department through Lawson Health Research Institute is great. They help us out. They're very supportive, but they just don't keep this kind of detailed accounting for us. And it is important when you're looking to invoice and you're looking to hire people, or for future studies to know, you know, did we lose money on this trial, or did we have a little bit of a buffer to then support startup for a new trial? So these are the kinds of things you need to think about long-term within your research groups. And that's all I'll say about that. And if folks have questions, they can reach out to me. Yeah, okay, sorry, I do have one more slide. So I did want to say it's really great. This can also help keep track of your payment schedule. So I feel like you really need to keep track on, are you being paid monthly? Are you being paid quarterly? How do you receive payment? How, within your budget, how have you set up to receive payment? Are you getting it automatically? Do you need to send invoices? It's probably a mixture of both. So for us, most of our sponsor trials, we get automatically paid for our per patient portion of the study, and then all of our invoiceables is up to us to send. And, you know, people, they're not going to remind you to send these invoices. If it's in your contract and in your budget, you have to know to invoice for them. And then what triggers these payments? Is it completed visits? Is it completed data entry? And that'll be important to communicate with staff at your site. And then it's also great this way within your financial management to set recruitment goals and timelines to be able to budget for staff salaries and different things like that. Okay, so we only have 2 slides left, which is great. So we will have some time for questions. So I just added a couple of questions on budgeting during COVID. So this is obviously new to everyone on the call. So I'm sure people would have things to add. But for us at our site, we are going through a lot of study amendments. We have some projects that are being extended because of COVID, so they want to follow folks longer because some visits have been missed. And so we're in the process of renegotiating the budget, you know, got 4 or 5 new visits tacked onto the end. Well, you're going to have to negotiate a budget to accommodate that. And then we did have some discussions about increased administrative tasks, so scanning and uploading files for remote monitoring. At our site, we've actually already been doing that a lot. So there wasn't a huge change when COVID hit. A lot of our stuff was done remotely. That being said, I think you do have to think about your site's equipment when thinking about remote monitoring and uploading files. So all scanners are not created equally. We have learned that the hard way also. So a little, desktop scanner doesn't scan too quickly, but we have a massive scanner in our back room, and it'll scan, pages lickety split. So if this is going to be the new norm, then you're going to want to have the equipment that'll make this easiest for yourself and for other staff members. And so you can look into costing those things out. Also, I know that depending on what your sponsor wants, you might, for example, have 100 pages for a visit. I'm exaggerating, but let's say you have 100 pages that you upload for a large visit, and they want it split for different types of assessments. So we have Adobe Professional, where you can actually scan them all together. It takes 1 minute to scan it, and then you can just clip the Adobe file and then upload them all separate, versus scanning 5 pages and uploading it to one section of your ECRF and then etc. So there are different things that will save you time. And those are really important right now, because I feel like we're all bogged down with additional administrative tasks. And I think it's okay to ask for budget amendments right now. So if you need to request a budget amendment, I think sponsors are really open to that right now. They know that there are different costs, and every site's in has a different situation, and they're open to discussion. So I think don't be afraid to reach out to sponsors if you need to. And then understanding your local regulations for clinical research visits is really important. We're part of Lawson Health Research Institute, and so they've been really great at communicating where we're at with that. So our site individually, we're at phase 1 of the reopening. Some sites are at phase 2, and so you just need to know what that means for your site, how many staff are allowed on site if you're within a hospital, and that kind of thing. And so keeping in regular contact with the folks within your institution that you need to understand what you're allowed to do right now. Which brings me to my next slide, which is important because on a per patient model, the challenge during a pandemic is work done is work paid. So if you're able to kind of see participants right now safely and following all the guidelines of your individual institutions, then you should be, because now's the time. I think we all worry about a second wave and maybe having a little bit more restrictions in the fall that may or may not happen, I don't know, but being prepared for that. So if you can see some folks now, while things are, opening up a little bit more, that's great, as long as you're safe to do so. I know that our research group has been very fortunate. We've been able to work during COVID, and we've come up with really creative ways to do so and to stay engaged with each other. And so I'm hoping that other groups have had that opportunity too. And this is it's going to vary significantly between groups, but trying to work through this time, I think, is challenging, and we can all maybe learn from each other and different experiences other folks have had. So we've actually, one of our observational trials, we weren't able to see participants, but we were actually able to do some double data entry and do some data cleaning to be able to do a data release earlier for that particular project. So it was, it was quite boring, unfortunately, for the staff members that were involved having to do that work at home, but it kept them engaged and it kept them employed. And at the end of the day, our research project will benefit from this, because we're going to have data to release sooner than we thought we would have. So some silver lining for sure. So just in summary, we've talked about what a clinical trial study budget is, some challenges to think about, the importance of feasibility. We looked at the CTO budgeting tool, which I highly recommend everyone use. We discussed some financial management issues and budgeting during COVID. So that's the end. I realize I've only left 5 minutes for questions, but yeah, I'm happy to take some.